Hi everyone. So I just wanted to do a very quick video to kind of go over some things for this particular week. So intro to criminal justice here, and now we're in week 13. So let me just scroll down in our class. So this is what you should still be seeing on your front page and on course. So usual setup, we have some readings here that are inside the PowerPoints, and then also the test this week. We don't have an assignment to complete this week. But the thing that's being covered this week is probation, parole, and other intermediate sanctions. So essentially like community corrections is another term for this. It has to do with punishment that occurs out in the community as opposed to behind bars incarceration. So one of the kind of pet peeves of mine is that people often don't know the difference between probation and parole. So I wanted to point that out. This is my PowerPoint that I created, and if you open up that PowerPoint, you notice that I'm actually focusing on probation. I don't discuss parole until later on in my usual course setups. So there's some really important stuff in this chapter 12 PowerPoints here. So let me open that. And I wanted to take you down to this slide. And let me see if I can just minimize this and make this bigger on the side here. And hopefully you can see this in the screen that it's actually recording. So the big thing that I wanted to kind of hit home this week is the difference between probation and parole. And there's a couple different things. So people often use these terms interchangeably, but they're actually very different types of community corrections, okay? So probation is when someone is under the watchful eye of corrections out in the community. Same thing for parole. Someone is under the watchful eye of corrections, but they're out in the community. So that's the similarity in the sense that both people are being observed by some sort of officer, either their probation officer or parole officer. And both, if you're under probation or parole, you would be following the same exact, well, very similar types of restrictions, okay? And some of those restrictions could be staying sober. It could be finding a job or staying employed. It could be staying away from other people who have a criminal record. So there's a whole host of restrictions that go under living under probation or parole. But there's some big differences, okay? So probation is an alternative to incarceration that is given, it's a sentence given by a judge that is just plainly an alternative to incarceration. So instead of being incarcerated, someone would possibly be sentenced to probation if they're a first-time, low-level, nonviolent offender, okay? And then I'll go to this next slide too, of the authority and characteristics. So I did mention that a judge is always someone who would be implementing probation and the characteristics of the offender. So generally these are nonviolent offenders. Lots of times it's first-time offenders, just things that don't necessarily involve very heinous crimes, for instance. How that differs from parole, on the right side of the table here, is that parole is also an alternative to incarceration, but it occurs after someone has spent time in a correctional facility, generally a prison. And so what happens with parole is that an individual generally is not sentenced to parole from the get-go. They'd be sentenced to prison. And so they'd be serving time for a more serious sentence, usually a felony. And then after being released, and that would be after serving their entire full sentence, or it may be that they're released early from their sentence that they served, say 90% of their sentence, and they were eligible to be released early, and then they go up to a parole board. So parole, it is in essence an alternative to incarceration, but it's only after that the individual has served some amount of time, okay? So that's different from probation, right? Because probation is truly an alternative to incarceration, but parole occurs after the full sentence or it's an early release, okay? Another thing that's a little bit different of probation and parole, that parole is not generally sentenced by a judge. It's an administrative decision wherein a parole board would be making the decision to have someone be released early or not, okay? And so that is another important distinction. And then, of course, the characteristics of the offenders is that generally someone who's on parole has already been serving time in a prison, and so they are inherently serving more serious crimes because prisons are generally housing people who are convicted of felonies. So those are just a handful of the differences between probation and parole that are really important to know. And then as you go through the material later on, you'll probably see some under parole and reentry is when I generally talk about parole, but I just wanted to share that information with you now to kind of hit home the importance of those two terms and the fact that they are different, okay? So you'll have your Chapter 12 test that you'll complete this week, and of course it's about more than just probation and parole. There's other intermediate or community sanctions that's discussed this week. But next week you won't have any tests because that is the holiday break, and then we just have a couple weeks left before final exam week. So hopefully you're kind of moving along things well, and if you have any questions as you move forward, of course, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. But I just wanted to kind of create this video to just quickly go over those two terms and those differences. Okay, well, enjoy.